In 2021, a genetics lab in China ran the most complete DNA study ever done on the Tarim mummies. These are the blonde-haired, wool-wearing bodies pulled out of one of the harshest desert environments in Eurasia. The results forced researchers to drop the Indo-European migration theory entirely. The mummies showed no Western Steppe ancestry, no European DNA, and no real connection to the migration waves that everyone had assumed brought them to Western China. What they carried instead was a gene pool old enough and isolated enough that researchers are still arguing about what it means for our model of Bronze Age human movement. This is that story. And two other finds, one underwater off northwest Australia and one in a cave in Sulawesi, will show you why the Tarim discovery didn't just rewrite what we know about one group of mummies, it shifted how researchers think about human isolation altogether. For decades, the Tarim mummies sat in Chinese museums, looking unmistakably Western. Tall, light-featured, with red and blonde hair. Their wool clothing had plaid weaving patterns that reminded researchers of European textiles. The problem? Nobody could agree on where they came from. The leading theory pointed to the Western Steppe, to a Bronze Age culture called the Afanassievo. Indo-Europeans pushing east from the Pontic grasslands, the same group known for spreading horse culture across Central Asia. The theory fit their appearance. It fit the geography. For a long time, it was the best available answer. Then the DNA results came in. And that best available answer turned out to be wrong. The Tarim Basin is a natural fortress, ringed by the highest peaks on Earth. The Himalayas to the south, the Kunlun to the east, the Tian Shan to the north. In the center is the Taklamakan Desert. Less than 10 millimeters of rain per year, about 0.4 inches, one of the driest places on the planet. Starting around 2100 BC, a group of people lived in the oases along the desert's edge. Snowmelt from the surrounding mountains created thin strips of livable land. They buried their dead at a site called Shauha in wooden boats surrounded by grave goods. The extreme cold and dryness preserved everything, faces, hair, textiles, intact for 4,000 years. Some of the bodies still had eyelashes. I remember reading that detail for the first time and just stopping for a second. You don't expect that. When Fan Zhang and Yin-Chao Chui's team at Jilin University published their full DNA analysis in 2021, they were testing the steppe migration theory head-on. The DNA told a different story. About 72% of the Shauha population's ancestry came from ancient North Eurasians, a Pleistocene Ice Age gene pool related to a 17,000-year-old specimen called Afontova Gora III, found near modern Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. The rest was a genetic signature from ancient Northeast Asia. No Western Steppe ancestry, no BMAC ancestry. BMAC stands for the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, the powerful Bronze Age farming culture based in what is now Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. No genetic signal from Europe, not a trace. Their Western appearance wasn't the result of Western migration. It was a holdover. Physical features carried intact from an Ice Age gene pool locked in place since before the Bronze Age even began. They looked Western because they and Europeans were both echoes of the same ancient ancestor, a shared root roughly 9,000 years before the mummies were buried. This population had been genetically sealed for thousands of years. Despite living along what would later become the Silk Road, despite trading with neighbors, growing wheat, and consuming dairy, almost no outside genes got in. For roughly 2,000 years. Culturally, they were connected. Genetically, they mostly weren't. A people that absorbed ideas from the world around them while keeping their bloodlines almost entirely intact. And the Tarim Basin wasn't the only place this happened. Two other populations seem to have run a surprisingly similar experiment at roughly the same time on opposite sides of the ancient world. During the last ice age, sea levels were about 120 meters lower than today, roughly 395 feet. A vast shelf of coastal land extended off northwest Australia, covering 400,000 square kilometers, about 154,000 square miles, larger than California and Oregon combined. When researchers at Griffith University mapped the modern seafloor using high-resolution sonar, they didn't find a flat corridor. They found a full landscape. Rivers, gorges, and what looks like a 2,000 square kilometer freshwater lake in the region now called the Kimberley. Population models suggest somewhere between 50,000 and 500,000 people lived here at its peak. For tens of thousands of years, this may have been one of the most populated coastal environments in the ancient world. Then, around 14,500 years ago, sea levels rose 4 to 5 meters per century. That's roughly 1 meter every 20 years. Over 400 years, more than 100,000 square kilometers went underwater. A second rise between 12,000 and 9,000 years ago took another 100,000. Stone tool deposits at inland sites like Majid Bebe spike at exactly these moments. The dramatic rock art appearing in Arnhem Land right at this same time, the dynamic figures and the Guion paintings, may be the visual record of hundreds of thousands of people being pushed into a shrinking landscape. The thing I keep getting stuck on isn't the drowning. It's how unhurried it was. A meter every 20 years. You could live a whole life and barely notice your grandmother's village was further inland than yours. Not a disaster in the way we typically think, just water. Slow, steady, and permanent. That shelf is now under 120 meters of ocean. We've never recovered DNA from it. We've never found the bones. But the mark of their retreat survives in the sites they ran to. A people who thrived on a productive coastal plain for around 60,000 years, gone in roughly 4 centuries. Sulawesi sits in Wallacea, a chain of islands between Southeast Asia and New Guinea, always cut off from the Asian and Australian shelves by deep ocean channels. Even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, you couldn't walk here. You had to cross open water. In a cave called Leang Panninge, which means bat cave, researchers recovered the mostly intact skeleton of a young woman buried roughly 7,000 years ago. She was connected to a stone tool tradition called the Toalean complex. Johannes Krause's team at the Max Planck Institute decoded her DNA. They expected a fairly standard result. Early modern humans passing through Wallacea on their way to Australia with some Denisovan admixture along the route. Denisovans were an ancient human group related to Neanderthals. The Denisovan ancestry wasn't especially surprising. The stranger part was everything else. A large portion of her ancestry came from an ancient Asian population that arrived in Wallacea 3,500 years before the known spread of East Asians into the region. And once you peel away the Denisovan DNA and that Asian ancestry, the rest matched nothing. No living population, no known ancient specimen, a lineage of people who, until now, didn't exist in our history books. When I first read about this, I kept going back to that phrase, matches nothing. That's not a gap in the data. That's a people who thrived, left one skeleton, and otherwise disappeared completely from the record. When Austronesian-speaking farmers arrived from Taiwan around 3,500 years ago, the agricultural expansion that reshaped all of island Southeast Asia, the lineages already living in Wallacea were absorbed or replaced almost entirely. We only know this woman's people existed because of one burial in one cave on one island. And then they were gone. 3 populations. 3 different endings, but the same underlying mechanism. The Northwest Shelf people lost their world to rising water in roughly 400 years. They had thrived on that coast for around 60,000 years. The woman in Leang, Panninge, came from a lineage that survived isolation on an island for tens of thousands of years, until farmers arrived from Taiwan with new crops and bigger numbers. The Tarim people held out for 2,000 years in one of the harshest places in Eurasia, and then the Silk Road found them. None of them were wiped out in the way we usually picture it. No famine, no collapse. They were absorbed by the moment the rest of the world showed up. We don't inherit the full story. We inherit whoever was still around when the mixing started. And the question none of these research teams have fully answered: how many more populations like this are still out there, under the water, in the desert, in a cave that archaeologists simply haven't excavated yet? Which of these 3 populations do you think left the clearest trace in people alive today? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. You just watched DNA rewrite the story of the Tarim Basin. Now watch it do the same thing to the Hittites.